The candle on the dressing table shook when Alina's hand shook, and her hand shook because her mother's voice had turned sharp again. "Sit still," Margaret Whitmore said, pulling the pins tighter into her younger daughter's hair. "Tonight is not about you. Tonight is about your sister." Alina did not answer. She had learned long ago that answering only made the pins pull harder. Downstairs, the carriage wheels were already being oiled. In an hour, the Whitmore family would arrive at the grandest ball London had seen in years, hosted by a man every unmarried woman in the city had been whispering about for weeks. The Duke of Ashworth, a man who had inherited more land than half the kingdom, and who was said to look at every eager young lady with the same cold, unmoved stare. Every mother wanted her daughter to catch his eye. Margaret Whitmore wanted it more than most, because the Whitmore fortune had been shrinking for 3 years, quietly, the way a candle burns down without anyone noticing until the room goes dark. And Margaret had already decided which daughter would save them. "Cassandra will wear the blue silk," she said, not looking at Alina. "You will wear the gray." Alina glanced at the gray dress hanging on the wardrobe door. It was well made, modest, and utterly forgettable, exactly as it was meant to be. "Yes, mother," she said. Across the hall, Cassandra was already laughing at something in the mirror, turning this way and that, watching the blue silk catch the candlelight like water catching moonlight. She was beautiful in a way that made rooms go quiet when she entered them. Alina had grown up standing just behind that beauty in its shadow, and she had stopped minding it years ago. Or she told herself she had stopped minding it. "You will sit near the back," Margaret continued, finishing the last pin. "You will smile if anyone speaks to you, and you will not speak first. Do you understand me, Alina? Tonight belongs to your sister." "I understand," Alina said quietly. She always understood. That was the trouble with being the quiet daughter. Everyone assumed her silence meant agreement, when really it was only the sound of a girl who had learned it was easier not to fight. By the time the carriage rolled up outside Ashworth House, the sky had turned a deep violet, and every window of the great stone building blazed with candlelight. Alina could hear the music before the footman even opened the door, a swirl of violins pouring out into the cold night air, mixing with laughter and the clatter of 100 polished shoes on marble floors. Cassandra stepped out first, and a small crowd near the entrance turned to look at her. She smiled the smile she had practiced since she was 12 years old, the one that made strangers feel as though they had been chosen for something special. Alina stepped out next, and no one turned at all. She did not mind, or she told herself again that she did not mind. Inside, Ashworth House was even grander than the rumors had promised. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light. The walls were lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and beneath them, London's most eligible daughters moved in bright silks, fanning themselves, watching each other, waiting. Margaret guided Cassandra toward the center of the room, where the crowd was thickest, where the chance of being noticed was highest. Alina followed a few steps behind, then further behind, until her mother's hand found her wrist and steered her toward a row of chairs against the far wall. "Sit here," Margaret said, "and remember what I told you." Alina sat. From her seat near the wall, she had a clear view of the entire ballroom, the way a person watching from the shore has a clear view of the sea. She watched the dancers turn in slow, practiced circles. She watched mothers whisper behind their fans, calculating which young man belonged to which fortune. She watched her sister laugh at the center of a growing circle of admirers, her blue silk gown glowing under the chandeliers like a flame that refused to be ignored. It was, Alina thought, exactly the evening her mother had promised. Cassandra dazzling, Alina forgotten, the world continuing on exactly as it always did. She let her mind wander, the way she often did at these events, imagining herself somewhere else entirely, in the library at home, perhaps, with a book open on her knees and no one telling her where to sit or how to smile. It was a small escape, but it was hers, and no one could take it from her. She did not notice, at first, that someone was watching her. He stood near one of the tall windows on the far side of the ballroom, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, his dark coat cut so precisely that it seemed almost unfair how well it suited him. He was young for a duke, younger than the gossip had led people to expect, with an expression that gave nothing away. Women had been trying to catch his attention all evening, tilting their heads, laughing a little too loudly at nothing in particular. He had responded to none of it. He was not responding to anyone, except that his eyes, more than once, drifted toward the quiet girl in gray sitting near the back wall, the one who was not trying to be seen at all. Julian Ashworth had attended 100 balls like this one, and he had grown tired of every single one of them. He knew, better than most, what it felt like to be watched for what a person could offer rather than who they were. His title made him valuable, his fortune made him desirable, and so every smile aimed in his direction felt, to him, like a hand reaching for something behind his face rather than the man standing in front of it. That was why the girl in gray caught his attention. She was not smiling at him. She was not smiling at anyone. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the room with an expression that seemed almost amused, as though she found the entire spectacle faintly ridiculous. The fans, the whispers, the careful performances everyone around her was giving. He found himself watching her instead of the dance floor. "You are staring, Your Grace," said a voice beside him. It belonged to Lord Henry Vane, a friend from his university days, now leaning against the same window with a knowing smile. At the Whitmore girl, no less, the younger one. Julian did not look away from her. "I am not staring." "You have been staring for the better part of 10 minutes, Henry chuckled. "Careful. Her mother will have you engaged to the elder sister before the night is through, if she notices you looking anywhere near that family." "I am simply observing the room," Julian said, though even to his own ears the words sounded thin. Henry followed his gaze toward the row of chairs near the wall. "The elder sister is the one everyone is trying to introduce you to, Cassandra Whitmore, quite the beauty by every account. The younger one," he squinted, as though trying to recall a detail that did not matter to most people in the room, "Eleanor, I believe, quieter sort, doesn't say much. I don't think I have ever heard her voice above a whisper." Julian said nothing, but something in Henry's description settled into him strangely. A quiet sort, doesn't say much. In a room full of people who said far too much, that description felt less like a flaw and more like a rare and curious thing. Across the ballroom, Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, unaware that she was being discussed at all. She had noticed the Duke, of course. Everyone had noticed the Duke, the moment he arrived, tall and composed and utterly unmoved by the fuss surrounding him. She had assumed, as she assumed most things about grand and important men, that he would move through the evening untouched by anyone in it, least of all a girl in a gray dress sitting quietly by the wall. She was not looking for his attention. She had been raised, quite firmly, not to want it. And yet, when she glanced up briefly, scanning the crowd out of simple habit, her eyes met his across the width of the ballroom. For a moment, neither of them looked away. It lasted only a second or two, the kind of accidental glance that happens 100 times in a crowded room and means nothing at all. Eleanor looked down first, her cheeks warming slightly, and told herself it had been nothing. A stranger's eyes passing over a stranger's face. That was all. But across the room, Julian Ashworth found that his glass of wine had gone entirely forgotten in his hand, and that for the first time all evening, he did not want to look away. "Julian," Henry said again, amused. "You are staring." "I am not," Julian said, and finally turned back toward his friend, though something in his chest had shifted, quietly, like a door opening a crack in a house he had thought was fully closed. Near the wall, Margaret Whitmore returned to check on her younger daughter, satisfied to find Eleanor exactly where she had left her, sitting quietly, drawing no attention, exactly as instructed. "Good girl," she murmured, before hurrying back toward Cassandra's circle of admirers. Eleanor did not tell her mother about the glance across the room. She was not entirely sure herself that it had meant anything at all. But she found for the rest of the evening that her eyes kept drifting back toward the tall window where the Duke of Ashworth stood, and more than once when she looked, she found that he was already looking back. The carriage ride home was quiet, filled only with the sound of wheels on cobblestone and Cassandra's happy recounting of every compliment she had received that evening. Margaret listened with pride, nodding along, already planning which invitation to accept next. Alina sat by the window, watching the dark streets pass by, saying nothing. She kept turning the evening over in her mind, the way one turns over a stone to see what lies beneath it. She told herself, again and again, that a single glance across a crowded room meant nothing. Dukes did not notice quiet girls in gray dresses. The world simply did not work that way. And yet, when she closed her eyes that night, it was not the music or the chandeliers or her sister's laughter that stayed with her. It was the way his gaze had held hers, steady and unhurried, as though for one brief moment she had not been invisible at all. 3 days later, a note arrived at the Whitmore house, and it was not addressed to Cassandra. Margaret turned the cream envelope over in her hands twice, as though checking whether her eyes had deceived her. The seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable, a hawk with its wings spread, the crest of the house of Ashworth. Her fingers trembled as she broke it open, already imagining a proposal of marriage, already imagining the relief that would pour through the family like sunlight after a long winter. But the note was short, and it was addressed to Alina. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret read aloud, her voice tightening with confusion. "The Duke of Ashworth requests the honor of your company at a small gathering at Ashworth House this Thursday, alongside your family." The room went very still. Cassandra, who had been arranging fresh flowers by the window, turned sharply. "Read that again." Margaret read it again, and the words did not change no matter how many times she repeated them. The invitation named Alina first, not Cassandra, Alina. "There must be some mistake," Cassandra said, setting the flowers down harder than she meant to. "Perhaps his secretary confused our names." "Perhaps," Margaret said slowly, though her eyes had narrowed in a way Alina recognized well. It was the look her mother wore when she was recalculating a plan that had gone slightly off course. Alina said nothing. She had not expected anything to come of that single glance across the ballroom, and she still did not quite believe it had. But something small and warm had settled in her chest the moment she heard her own name read aloud from that letter, and she found she could not quite make it go away, no matter how firmly she told herself it meant nothing. "Well," Margaret said finally, folding the letter and setting it on the mantel as though it were something delicate that might break. "We shall attend, of course, all of us. And Alina," she turned, her expression sharpening again, "you will remember your place. This is likely nothing more than politeness on the Duke's part. Perhaps he mistook your name for your sister's when writing the invitation. You will not embarrass this family by assuming otherwise." "Yes, Mother," Alina said. But that night, lying awake in her narrow bed, she allowed herself, just once, to imagine that it had not been a mistake at all. Thursday arrived gray and cool, with a soft rain falling over London that made the cobblestones shine like dark glass. The Whitmore carriage rolled up to Ashworth House once more, though this time the grand building seemed quieter, its many windows lit with a gentler, more private glow than the blazing chandeliers of the ball. A footman led them through a smaller hall than the ballroom, into a drawing room where a fire crackled in a wide stone hearth, and perhaps a dozen guests sat in comfortable conversation. It was, Alina realized with some surprise, a far more intimate gathering than she had expected, not the sprawling crowd of the ball, but a carefully chosen circle. Julian Ashworth rose from his chair the moment they entered. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, greeting Margaret with practiced courtesy. "Miss Whitmore." He turned to Cassandra with a polite nod. Then his eyes moved to Alina, and something in his expression shifted just slightly into something warmer. "Miss Alina, I am glad you came." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. The evening unfolded slowly, filled with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of teacups. Cassandra, seated near the Duke at first, worked through her usual repertoire of charming remarks and delighted laughter, and for a while it seemed the evening might unfold exactly as Margaret had hoped. But as the hours passed, Alina noticed that whenever the conversation opened to the wider group, the Duke's attention kept drifting toward her, toward the corner where she sat quietly listening rather than speaking. "You have said very little this evening, Miss Alina," he said at last, during a lull in the conversation, when most of the other guests had drifted into smaller groups near the fire. Alina felt her cheeks warm. "I find I have little to add, Your Grace. Your other guests seem far better suited to entertaining conversation than I am." "I do not think that is true," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up and meet his eyes properly for the first time that evening. "I think you simply choose your words carefully, rather than filling silence for its own sake. It is a rare quality. Or perhaps I have simply been told, many times, that silence is safer than speech," Alina said, before she could stop herself. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. She had not meant to say something so honest, so close to the truth of her own life, to a man she had only just properly met. But there was something about his steady gaze that made honesty feel less dangerous than it usually did. Julian tilted his head slightly, studying her with new interest. Safer, perhaps, but not always truer. Across the room, Margaret watched this exchange with growing unease, though she was careful to keep her expression pleasant for the benefit of the other guests. Cassandra, seated nearby, had noticed as well, and her smile had begun to look a little more fixed, a little less effortless than it had at the start of the evening. "Alina," Margaret called gently, though there was a warning beneath the gentleness. "Come and help me remember the name of Lady Pemberton's youngest daughter. I cannot recall it for the life of me." It was, Alina understood immediately, not truly about Lady Pemberton's daughter at all. It was a summons, a reminder, delivered in front of a room full of strangers, that she was not meant to hold anyone's attention for too long. "Excuse me," she said quietly to the Duke, rising from her seat. "Of course," he said, though his eyes followed her as she crossed the room, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what had just happened, even if he said nothing about it. For the rest of the evening, Alina kept carefully to the edges of conversation, exactly as her mother wished. But she noticed, more than once, that no matter where she positioned herself in the room, the Duke's gaze found her again and again, quiet and steady, as though he were keeping some private count of every moment she spent in silence. When the Whitmores finally rose to leave, Julian walked them to the door himself, an unusual courtesy for a man of his position. He bid Margaret and Cassandra a polite farewell, and then turned to Alina last. "I hope you will attend the theater with your family next week," he said. "There is a performance I believe you would find interesting. Shakespeare's comedies, I am told, reward those who listen closely rather than those who simply wish to be seen." Alina felt a small, surprised smile tug at her lips before she could stop it. "I shall look forward to it, Your Grace." "As will I," he said, and there was something in the simple honesty of those 3 words that stayed with her the entire ride home. In the carriage, Margaret said nothing for a long while, staring out at the rain-streaked window with an expression Alina could not quite read. Cassandra, beside her, had gone unusually quiet as well, her earlier brightness dimmed into something colder and more watchful. "That was strange," Cassandra said finally, breaking the silence. "Don't you think it strange, Mother? A duke paying such attention to Alina, of all people." "It is nothing," Margaret said quickly, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Young men are sometimes curious about quiet girls. It rarely lasts. He will tire of her silence soon enough and return his attention to more suitable company." She glanced at Alina, her expression sharp again. "You will not encourage this, Alina. Do you understand me? Whatever passing interest the Duke has shown you, it is not your place to encourage it. Your sister's future depends on this match, and I will not have you interfering with it out of some foolish desire to be noticed." Alina turned to look out her own window, watching the rain trace long silver lines down the glass. "I have not encouraged anything, Mother. I have only answered when spoken to." "See that it stays that way," Margaret said. But even as she said it, even as Alina nodded and promised, once again, to remain quiet and unremarkable, something inside her had begun to shift, something small but stubborn, a quiet certainty that she had not asked for the Duke's attention. And yet, For the first time in her life, she found she did not entirely wish to give it up. That night, long after the house had gone dark and quiet, Alina sat by her window with a single candle burning low beside her, thinking not of her mother's warnings or her sister's cold silence in the carriage, but of a single sentence spoken in a warm drawing room by a man who had looked at her as though she were worth listening to. "It rarely lasts," her mother had said. Alina was not so certain anymore. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, and somewhere across the city, in a grand house full of empty rooms and quiet halls, Julian Ashworth stood at his own window, thinking of a girl who chose her words carefully, and wondering, for the first time in a long while, whether he had finally found someone in this city who was not performing for his attention at all. The theater was full that night, every box glowing with candlelight, every seat filled with London's most fashionable families dressed in their finest. Alina sat between her mother and her sister, her hands folded in her lap, watching the stage below where actors moved through the bright chaos of a comedy she only half followed, her attention drawn again and again toward the private box across the theater where the Duke of Ashworth sat with two of his friends. He had greeted them warmly upon arrival, exactly as he had promised, and though propriety kept him in his own box for most of the performance, Alina caught him looking toward her more than once during the quieter scenes, when the actors paused and the audience leaned forward together. At the interval, as guests rose to stretch their legs and gather in the wide corridors outside the boxes, Julian appeared at their side. "Miss Alina," he said, offering a small bow, "might I trouble you for a brief walk? The corridor is far less crowded near the East Gallery, and I confess I find myself in need of air." Margaret's fan paused mid-motion. For a moment, Alina thought her mother might refuse on her behalf, but refusing a duke in front of half of fashionable London was not something even Margaret Whitmore dared to do. "Of course," Margaret said, her smile stretched thin. "Do not wander far, Alina." The East Gallery was quieter, lined with tall windows that looked out over the wet, glistening streets below. Julian walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to walk together in the cool evening air. "You did not laugh once during the second act," he said finally, glancing sideways at her. "And yet everyone around you was laughing quite loudly." Alina smiled faintly. "I found the humor a little unkind, Your Grace. The joke relied entirely on mocking a foolish old man for being foolish. It did not seem terribly clever to me, only cruel dressed up as comedy." "An honest opinion," Julian said, sounding pleased rather than offended. "Most people in this city tell me only what they think I wish to hear. It grows tiresome, hearing the same polite agreement over and over, no matter what I say." "Perhaps they are afraid of disappointing you," Alina said. "A duke's opinion carries a great deal of weight. People often shape their own opinions around what they believe powerful men wish to hear." "And you," he asked, stopping near one of the tall windows, turning to face her properly, "are you afraid of disappointing me?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she considered giving the safe answer, the practiced answer her mother would have wanted. But something about the quiet corridor, and the honesty already exchanged between them, made the safe answer feel like a small betrayal of something she was only beginning to understand about herself. "No," she said finally, "I do not think I am, Your Grace. I have spent most of my life being told not to speak too much, not to be noticed too much, not to want too much. I have grown rather used to disappointing people simply by existing as I am. I find I have very little left to fear on that account." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is the way I was raised," Alina said simply. "My sister was born to shine, and I was born to sit beside her and admire the shining. It is not a tragedy, Your Grace. It is simply how things are." "I do not think it should be how things are," Julian said, his voice quieter now, more serious than she had heard it before. "I think a person who chooses her words as carefully as you do, who sees a joke's cruelty when everyone else only sees its humor, who speaks with more honesty in a single sentence than most people manage in an entire evening. I think such a person deserves rather more than a seat at the back of the room." Alina felt her breath catch slightly, and she looked away, toward the rain-streaked window, unsure how to answer something so unexpectedly kind. "You should not say such things to me, Your Grace," she said softly. "My mother has made it very clear that your attention belongs elsewhere." "Your mother," Julian said, with the faintest edge of dry humor, "does not choose where my attention goes." Before Alina could respond, footsteps echoed at the end of the corridor, and Cassandra appeared, her expression carefully arranged into pleasant curiosity, though her eyes moved quickly between Alina and the Duke with something far sharper underneath. "There you are," Cassandra said, her voice bright. "Mother sent me to fetch you both. The next act is about to begin." "Of course," Julian said, offering Cassandra a polite nod before turning back to Alina. "Miss Alina." "Your Grace," she said, and followed her sister back toward the boxes, aware the entire way of Cassandra's silence, which felt far heavier than any words could have been. The remainder of the performance passed in a blur for Alina, her mind circling again and again around the Duke's words in the quiet corridor. She deserved more than a seat at the back of the room. No one had ever said such a thing to her before, and she was not entirely sure what to do with the warmth it had left behind in her chest. The carriage ride home was tense in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Cassandra sat with her arms folded, staring out the window, saying nothing at all, which Alina found far more unsettling than her usual sharp remarks. "You were gone rather a long time," Margaret said finally, breaking the silence. "The two of you in the East Gallery." "We spoke of the performance, Mother," Alina said carefully. "Nothing more." "Nothing more," Margaret repeated, her tone suggesting she did not believe a word of it. "Alina, I have warned you already about encouraging this. Do you understand what is at stake for this family? Your father's debts grow larger by the season. Your sister's match with the Duke would secure this family's future for a generation. If you insist on drawing his attention away from her, out of some selfish wish to feel important for once in your life, you will ruin everything we have worked toward." The words landed like small, sharp stones, each one finding its mark. Alina had never once thought of her quiet existence in the family as something she had chosen, but hearing her mother describe her own honesty as a selfish wish to feel important made something in her chest twist painfully. "I have not sought his attention, Mother," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have only answered honestly when he has spoken to me. I cannot control where a man chooses to look." "Then learn to make yourself less worth looking at," Margaret snapped, before seeming to catch herself, softening her tone only slightly. "I do not say this to be cruel, Alina. I say this because this family's survival depends on Cassandra's marriage, and I will not allow anything or anyone to interfere with it." "Not even you." Cassandra said nothing throughout this entire exchange, staring resolutely out the window, but Alina caught the faint tremor in her sister's jaw, the tightness around her eyes that suggested Cassandra's silence was not indifference at all, but something closer to hurt or fear or both. For the first time, Alina understood that her sister's brightness, the effortless charm she had always seemed to wear like a second skin, was perhaps not as effortless as it appeared. Cassandra, too, had been raised to believe her value depended entirely on being chosen by the right man, admired by the right people, dazzling enough to secure a future for a family that had placed the entire weight of its survival on her shoulders. It did not excuse the coldness that would follow in the days ahead, but it explained it, and Alina found she could not entirely hate her sister for it, even as she felt the first quiet fractures beginning to spread between them. That night, alone in her room, Alina took out a small sheet of paper and began, hesitantly, to write a letter she was not certain she would ever send. She wrote about the theater, about the quiet corridor, about a Duke who had told her she deserved more than a seat at the back of the room. She wrote, more than anything, about the strange and frightening feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life, and not knowing what to do with the fear and hope tangled together inside her. She did not sign the letter. She simply folded it and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept the few things in her life that belonged entirely to her, and no one else. Outside her window, the rain had finally stopped, and the city lay quiet and glistening beneath a pale, watery moon. Somewhere across that same city, in a grand house with too many empty rooms, Julian Ashworth stood at his own window once more, turning over the conversation in the East Gallery in his mind, and finding, much to his own surprise, that he could not stop thinking about a girl who had spent her whole life being told to want less, and who had somehow, despite everything, remained entirely, quietly, unmistakably herself. He did not yet know the full weight of what her family expected of her, nor the depth of the pressure closing in around her from every side. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he did not intend to look away from her again, no matter how many warnings her mother offered, and no matter how carefully Alina had been taught to disappear. The days that followed brought a coldness into the Whitmore house that no fire could quite chase away. Cassandra, who had once shared easy laughter with Alina over breakfast, now spoke to her sister only when necessary, her words clipped and polite in a way that felt far worse than open anger. Margaret watched every interaction between her daughters with narrowed eyes, and the servants, sensing the tension, moved through the house more quietly than usual, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile that might shatter at the slightest sound. Alina tried, in her own quiet way, to mend the growing distance. She complimented her sister's new gown before a garden party. She offered to help arrange Cassandra's hair, the way she had done since they were children. But Cassandra accepted each gesture with a thin, polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, and Alina understood with a growing ache that something between them had shifted in a way that kindness alone could not repair. "You must stop this," Margaret said one afternoon, cornering Alina in the small sitting room while Cassandra was occupied elsewhere. "The Duke has sent 2 more invitations this week, both addressed to you directly. Do you understand what this is doing to your sister, to this family?" "I have not asked for his invitations, Mother," Alina said, setting down the book she had been pretending to read. "I cannot refuse a Duke's correspondence without causing far greater scandal than accepting it." "Then you will attend these gatherings," Margaret said, "and you will make it abundantly clear to him that your sister is the more suitable match. You will speak of Cassandra's accomplishments. You will remind him, at every opportunity, of her beauty and her charm. Do you understand me?" Alina felt something tighten painfully in her chest. "You wish me to promote my sister to a man who has shown no interest in her, while pretending I feel nothing myself." Margaret's expression hardened. "I wish you to remember your place, Alina. You have always understood your place before. I do not know what has changed, but I expect you to remember it now more than ever." Alina said nothing further, though the conversation stayed with her long after her mother had left the room. She thought of the Duke's words in the theater corridor, the warmth in his voice when he told her she deserved more than a seat at the back of the room, and she wondered, with a growing sense of dread, how she was meant to reconcile her mother's demands with the quiet, stubborn hope that had begun to grow inside her. The following week, Alina attended a small luncheon at Ashworth House, accompanied once again by her mother and sister. True to her promise, she spent much of the afternoon steering conversation toward Cassandra's talents, her skill at the pianoforte, her fluent French, her gift for arranging flowers in a way that made even simple blooms look like works of art. Cassandra, for her part, performed beautifully, laughing at the right moments, complimenting the Duke's home with practiced grace. But Julian's attention, though politely divided among his guests, kept returning to Alina, even as she tried her best to remain unremarkable in the corner of the room. When she praised her sister's talents, he listened with polite interest, but his eyes searched Alina's face as though trying to understand why she spoke of everyone but herself. "You have said nothing of your own accomplishments, Miss Alina," he observed quietly, during a moment when the other guests had drifted toward the garden doors to admire the afternoon light. "I find that curious, given how thoroughly you have described your sisters." "I have little worth mentioning, Your Grace," Alina said, keeping her eyes carefully lowered. "I do not believe that," Julian said. I have watched you read 3 different books in the space of a single week, each one more difficult than the last. I have heard you correct a grammatical error in a poem recited by a man twice your age, so gently he did not even realize he had been corrected. I do not think a person with so little worth mentioning exists, Miss Aliner. I think you have simply been taught not to mention it. Aliner's throat tightened, and for a moment she could not find the words to answer him. It was not the first time he had seen through her careful performance of humility, but each time it happened, it grew harder to maintain the pretense her mother demanded of her. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended, "I must ask you not to say such things to me. It is not fair to either my sister or myself." Julian's expression softened, though something in his eyes remained steady and unmoving. "Is it your wish that I say them to your sister instead?" "It is my wish," Aliner said carefully, "that this family survive the season without further difficulty. My sister's marriage would secure our future, mine would not." "Why not?" Julian asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "Because your mother has told you so. Or because you believe it yourself." Aliner had no answer for that, not one she was willing to give aloud, and she was grateful when Lord Henry Vane appeared at that moment, drawing Julian into conversation about a horse race the following week, giving her the chance to slip quietly back toward her mother and sister without having to answer a question she had never dared to ask herself. That evening, in the privacy of her room, Aliner allowed herself, for the first time, to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, exhausted way of someone who had spent years holding herself carefully together and had finally begun to crack under the weight of it. She was tired of being asked to disappear. She was tired of watching her sister's hurt harden into resentment. She was tired, most of all, of pretending she did not feel the quiet, persistent hope that had taken root in her heart every time Julian Ashworth looked at her as though she mattered. She did not know yet what to do with any of it, but she knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that she could not continue pretending forever. Meanwhile, in his own study across the city, Julian sat before a dying fire, a glass of untouched brandy at his elbow, turning over the day's conversation in his mind. He had meant, when he first noticed Aliner Whitmore across a crowded ballroom, only to satisfy a passing curiosity. He had not expected to find himself, weeks later, unable to think of anything else. Not the estate matters awaiting his attention, not the political alliances his advisors urged him to consider, not even the string of eligible young women who continued to compete for his notice at every gathering he attended. He thought only of a quiet girl who had spent her whole life learning to want less than she deserved, and he found himself growing more determined, with each passing day, to show her that she did not have to want less any longer. He did not yet fully understand the depth of pressure closing in around her, the debts, the desperation, the quiet cruelty of a mother who saw her daughters as pieces on a board rather than people with hearts of their own. But he understood enough to know that whatever stood between them would not be easily overcome, and that Aliner Whitmore, whether she believed it or not, was worth the difficulty of overcoming it. The garden party at Lady Pemberton's estate promised to be the social event of the month, with acres of manicured lawns, a small orchestra playing beneath white tents, and enough eligible guests to fill 3 ballrooms. Margaret had spent days preparing Cassandra for the occasion, certain that a bright afternoon among flowers and sunshine would be the perfect setting to draw the Duke's attention back where she believed it belonged. Aliner, dressed once again in a plain but well-made gown, walked slightly behind her mother and sister as they moved through the crowded lawn greeting acquaintances, admiring the gardens, playing the roles expected of them. The afternoon sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass, and for a while, Aliner allowed herself simply to enjoy the beauty of the day, grateful for a brief reprieve from the tension that had settled over her family in recent weeks. She found herself drawn, eventually, toward a quieter section of the garden, away from the crowded lawn where her mother and sister remained deep in conversation with Lady Pemberton and her circle of friends. A narrow path wound between tall hedges, leading toward a small stone fountain surrounded by climbing roses, and Alina followed it gladly, grateful for a few moments of solitude. She did not expect to find Julian Ashworth already there. He stood near the fountain, his coat slightly loosened despite the formality of the occasion, watching the water trickle over smooth stones with an expression of quiet, unguarded exhaustion that Alina had never seen on him before. For a moment, she considered turning back, unwilling to intrude on a private moment. But he glanced up before she could retreat, and something in his face brightened immediately at the sight of her. "Miss Alina," he said, straightening slightly. "I did not expect to find anyone else who preferred quiet fountains to crowded lawns." "I confess I needed a moment away from the noise," Alina admitted, stepping closer despite herself. "Though I did not mean to intrude on your solitude, Your Grace." "You are not intruding," he said, gesturing toward the low stone bench beside the fountain. "Please, I would welcome the company if you are willing to offer it." Alina hesitated only briefly before sitting, the sound of the fountain filling the comfortable silence between them. For a while, neither spoke, content simply to sit together in the dappled shade of the climbing roses, away from the watchful eyes and careful performances of the wider party. "I grow tired of days like this," Julian said finally, his voice quieter and more honest than she had heard it before. "Every conversation feels rehearsed. Every smile feels calculated. I have spent years surrounded by people who wish only to secure my favor, and I confess I have grown weary of trying to determine who among them might actually wish to know me, rather than simply my title." Alina considered his words carefully before answering. "I understand that weariness better than you might expect, Your Grace, though for very different reasons. I have spent my life surrounded by people who wish me to be smaller, quieter, less than I am, so that others around me might shine more brightly. I have grown rather tired of trying to determine which parts of myself I am permitted to show, and which I must hide away." "You should not have to hide any part of yourself," Julian said, turning to face her fully. "Not from your family, not from anyone." "It is easy for you to say such things, Your Grace," Alina said, though there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet, tired honesty. "You have never had to earn your place in a room. You have never watched your family's survival depend on someone else's beauty, someone else's charm, while you were told again and again that your own worth lay only in staying quiet and out of the way." Julian was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened further. "You are right. I have never known that particular burden, but I know what it is to feel invisible despite being surrounded by people, Miss Alina. I know what it is to wonder whether anyone truly sees you, or only the title and fortune attached to your name. Perhaps our burdens are different, but I do not think they are entirely unfamiliar to one another." Alina looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw beneath the composed, unshakable exterior he presented to the world a man who carried his own quiet loneliness, his own weariness at being valued for everything except himself. It was, she realized with some surprise, the first time she had considered that a duke, with all his wealth and power, might understand isolation in a way not entirely unlike her own. "I did not expect to find common ground with you, Your Grace," she admitted softly. "Nor I with you," Julian said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And yet here we are." They talked for a long while after that, longer than either of them intended, the conversation drifting easily between quiet confessions and gentle observations, comfortable silences and unexpected laughter. Alina told him, hesitantly at first, about her love of books, about the small collection of poetry she kept hidden beneath her bed because her mother believed reading too much made a young woman unattractive to suitors. Julian told her, in turn, about the weight of managing an estate far too large for one man to oversee alone, about the loneliness of a childhood spent being groomed for responsibility rather than allowed simple joy. By the time they realized how much time had passed, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the garden. "I should return," Alina said reluctantly, rising from the bench. "My mother will wonder where I have gone." "Of course," Julian said, standing as well. He hesitated for a moment, then added more quietly, "Alina, I do not say this lightly. I have met a great many people in my life who wish to be seen by me. You are the first in a very long time who has simply allowed me to be seen myself, without expectation or performance. I find I am grateful for it, more than I can properly express." Elinor felt her heart quicken at the sound of her name, spoken without title, spoken simply, warmly, as though it belonged to someone worth knowing entirely on her own terms. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly. "I find myself grateful as well." They walked back toward the main lawn together, though they parted ways before reaching the crowd, each returning to their respective circles as though nothing unusual had passed between them. But something had changed, quietly and unmistakably, in the space between them, and both of them knew it, even as neither spoke of it aloud. Margaret noticed her daughter's absence the moment Elinor returned, and though she said nothing in front of the other guests, the sharp look she gave Elinor promised a difficult conversation once they returned home. Cassandra, standing beside their mother, noticed as well, and though her expression remained carefully composed, something cold and unhappy flickered behind her eyes. That evening, the carriage ride home was heavy with unspoken tension, the kind that pressed against the walls of the small enclosed space like an approaching storm. Elinor said nothing, staring out the window at the darkening countryside, holding close the memory of an afternoon spent beside a quiet fountain, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and unapologetically herself. She did not yet know how much that single afternoon would cost her, but she knew, with a quiet certainty that surprised her, that she would not trade it for anything. The following weeks brought a change in Cassandra that Elinor had not expected. Where before her sister's coldness had felt like quiet, wounded distance, it now sharpened into something far more deliberate. Elinor began noticing small things at first, an invitation that mysteriously never reached her hands, a message from a friend that arrived days later than it should have, whispered conversations between Cassandra and their mother that stopped abruptly whenever Elinor entered the room. She told herself at first that she was imagining things, that grief and tension had made her overly suspicious of a sister she had known and loved her entire life. But the pattern grew too consistent to ignore. It came to a head on the evening of Lady Ashford's dinner party, an event Elinor had been looking forward to for days, knowing the Duke would be in attendance. She had chosen her dress carefully that morning, laid out her gloves and shoes, prepared herself for an evening she had quietly, secretly hoped might bring her closer to understanding what exactly had grown between herself and Julian Ashworth. But when the hour came to depart, Elinor found herself suddenly and inexplicably unwell, a strange heaviness settling over her limbs, a dull ache spreading through her stomach that made standing upright nearly impossible. "You cannot possibly attend in this condition," Margaret said, though there was something in her tone that struck Elinor as strange, almost rehearsed. "Cassandra and I will go without you. You must rest." It was only the following morning, when Elinor mentioned her sudden illness to the family's longtime housekeeper, that she learned the truth. A small amount of something bitter had been added to her tea the previous afternoon, enough to cause genuine discomfort without any lasting harm, enough, precisely, to keep her confined to her bed for a single crucial evening. "I did not think it my place to say anything, miss," the housekeeper admitted, wringing her hands nervously. "But I saw Miss Cassandra near the kitchen that afternoon, and I did not think much of it at the time. I am sorry, miss. I should have said something sooner." Elinor sat very still for a long moment, absorbing the weight of this discovery. She had known, on some level, that her sister's jealousy had grown into something sharper than ordinary sibling rivalry. But she had not imagined Cassandra capable of something so deliberate, so calculated in its cruelty. She confronted her sister that same afternoon, finding Cassandra alone in the small sitting room, arranging fresh flowers with hands that trembled slightly when Elinor entered. "You made me ill on purpose," Elinor said quietly, closing the door behind her, "so that I could not attend Lady Ashford's dinner." Cassandra's hands stilled over the flowers, but she did not turn around immediately. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Please," Elinor said, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to remain calm. "Do not lie to me. Not about this. We are sisters, Cassandra. Whatever has grown between us these past weeks, I never imagined it would lead to something like this. Cassandra finally turned, and Alina was startled to see tears standing in her sister's eyes. Tears that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with a pain Alina had not fully understood until that moment. "You do not understand what it is like," Cassandra said, her voice shaking. "You have spent your whole life being told you are not enough, and I understand that pain, Alina, truly I do. But you have never once been told that your entire worth, your entire purpose, depends on being enough for everyone else. Mother has built this family's entire future on my shoulders since I was 12 years old. Every gown, every dance lesson, every carefully practiced smile, all of it has been in service of finding a match wealthy enough to save us from ruin. And now, after years of carrying that weight alone, I am meant to simply step aside and watch you take the one match that might have finally set me free." Alina felt her anger soften slowly into something closer to sorrow. She had spent so many years believing her own invisibility was the greater burden that she had never fully considered the weight her sister carried in return. The exhausting performance of perfection, the endless pressure to be beautiful and charming and desirable enough to save an entire family from financial ruin. "I did not ask for the Duke's attention," Alina said gently. "I promise you, Cassandra, I never once sought to take anything from you." "I know that," Cassandra said, wiping angrily at her tears. "I know it, and it makes everything worse somehow. You did not even have to try, Alina. You simply sat quietly in the corner exactly as you were told, and he chose you anyway. Do you have any idea what that does to a person, watching someone who never tried to compete win so effortlessly, when I have spent my entire life trying and trying and trying?" The sisters stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of years of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding settling heavily between them. Alina crossed the room slowly and, after a moment's hesitation, reached for her sister's hand. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I am sorry that Mother built this family's future on your shoulders alone. I am sorry that you have carried a burden I never fully understood. But making me ill, keeping me from an evening that mattered to me, was not the answer, Cassandra. It only hurt us both." Cassandra did not pull her hand away, though she said nothing for a long moment, staring down at their joined hands with an expression somewhere between shame and exhaustion. "I know," she said finally, her voice small. "I knew it even as I did it. I have not felt right since. I am sorry, Alina. Truly I am." It was not a complete reconciliation, not yet. The years of quiet imbalance between them could not be undone in a single afternoon, and Alina knew there would be more difficult conversations ahead before the fractures between them fully healed. But it was, she thought, a beginning, an honest acknowledgement of pain on both sides, rather than the careful performance of politeness that had governed their relationship for so long. Word of Alina's absence from Lady Ashford's dinner reached Julian the following day, delivered casually by Lord Henry Vane over a game of cards. "Strange, her missing such an important evening," Henry remarked, studying his cards with feigned indifference, "particularly given how attentive you have been toward her lately. I half expected her to be seated beside you all evening." Julian said nothing for a long moment, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest that he could not quite explain. He had noticed Alina's absence at the dinner, had found himself distracted throughout the evening, glancing repeatedly toward the door in the foolish hope that she might yet arrive. Something about the sudden, unexplained nature of her absence troubled him deeply, though he could not say precisely why. He called at the Whitmore house 2 days later, ostensibly to inquire after Alina's health, though in truth he found himself unable to stay away any longer. Margaret received him with careful pleasantness, informing him that Alina had recovered fully from a brief and unremarkable illness, though something in her tone suggested a story more complicated than the simple explanation offered. It was only when Alina herself entered the room, pale but composed, that Julian felt the tight knot of worry in his chest finally ease. He studied her carefully as she greeted him, searching for some sign of what had truly kept her away, and though she offered no explanation beyond a brief and unconvincing mention of a passing illness, he sensed with growing certainty that something within this household ran far deeper and more troubled than polite conversation could reveal. He resolved, quietly, to uncover the truth of it, not out of idle curiosity, but out of a growing conviction that Eleanor Whitmore was carrying a burden far heavier than anyone around her seemed willing to acknowledge, and that he, whatever the cost to propriety or convenience, intended to help her carry it. Julian did not confront the Whitmore family immediately. Instead, he spent the following days quietly gathering pieces of a picture that had begun to trouble him deeply. A conversation with Lord Henry, who knew the family's financial troubles better than most through his connections in banking circles. A careful word with Lady Pemberton, who mentioned, almost in passing, how tightly Margaret Whitmore controlled her younger daughter's every public appearance. And finally, a quiet conversation with the family's housekeeper, arranged discreetly through a mutual acquaintance, who confirmed what Julian had begun to suspect but had hoped was not true. He learned of the tea and the illness that had kept Eleanor from Lady Ashford's dinner. He learned of years of careful instruction to sit quietly, speak little, and never outshine her sister. He learned of a family whose survival had been placed, without her consent, upon Cassandra's shoulders, and of a mother who viewed her younger daughter not as a person deserving of happiness, but as an obstacle to be carefully managed. The knowledge settled over him like a weight he had not expected to carry, and it hardened slowly into a quiet and unshakable resolve. He called at the Whitmore house on a bright Tuesday morning, requesting a private audience with Margaret before Eleanor or Cassandra had risen for the day. Margaret received him in the small drawing room, her expression carefully composed, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face at the unusual formality of his request. "Your Grace," she said, gesturing him toward a chair, "this is an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe the honor of such an early visit?" "I will be direct, Mrs. Whitmore," Julian said, remaining standing rather than accepting the offered seat. "I have learned certain things about how your family has treated your younger daughter, and I confess I find myself unable to remain silent about it any longer." Margaret's composure faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace. Eleanor has always been treated with the same love and care as her sister." "Please," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being believed. "I know about the tea that kept her from Lady Ashford's dinner. I know about years of instruction to remain silent, to sit at the back of every room, to allow her sister's brightness to eclipse her own worth entirely. I know that this family's survival has been placed upon Cassandra's shoulders in a manner that has caused both your daughters considerable pain, though in very different ways." Margaret's face had gone pale, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "You do not understand the position this family has been in, Your Grace. Difficult choices had to be made. I have only ever tried to secure my daughter's futures, in the only way I knew how. By teaching one daughter that her worth depends entirely on her ability to charm a husband, and the other that her worth is so small it must be hidden away entirely." Julian's voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, sharp and unmistakable. "I do not doubt that you love your daughters, Mrs. Whitmore, but I think you have mistaken survival for the only measure of a good life, and in doing so you have caused both your daughters a great deal of unnecessary suffering." It was at that moment that Eleanor appeared in the doorway, having descended the stairs in search of her mother and finding, instead, this unexpected and deeply uncomfortable scene unfolding before her. She froze, uncertain whether to retreat or step forward, her heart racing at the sight of Julian standing so firmly, so protectively, in her family's drawing room. "Your Grace," she said finally, stepping into the room, "what is happening here?" Julian turned toward her immediately, his expression softening the moment his eyes found hers. "Eleanor, I apologize if this is unwelcome. I could not, in good conscience, remain silent any longer about what I have learned regarding how you have been treated in this house." Eleanor felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. embarrassment at having her private pain exposed so openly, gratitude at finally having someone acknowledge the weight of it, and fear at what consequences might follow from such an open confrontation with her mother. "You did not need to say anything," she said quietly, though there was no real anger in her voice. "I disagree," Julian said, turning back toward Margaret. "I have spent weeks watching a remarkable young woman taught, again and again, that her honesty, her intelligence, her very presence in a room was something to be minimized rather than celebrated. I will not pretend I did not notice it, Mrs. Whitmore, nor will I pretend I do not find it deeply troubling." Margaret rose from her chair, her earlier composure crumbling into something closer to desperation. "Your Grace, please. Whatever mistakes I have made, I beg you to understand the position I have been in. This family's debts grow larger with each passing season. Without a favorable match, we face ruin, the loss of this house, the loss of everything my daughters have ever known. I have done what I believed necessary to protect them, even if my methods were imperfect." "I understand fear, Mrs. Whitmore," Julian said, his tone softening slightly, though his resolve remained unshaken. "But fear does not excuse cruelty, however well-intentioned. Alina deserves to be valued for who she is, not managed as an obstacle to your family's survival." He turned back to Alina then, and something in his expression shifted entirely, softening into an openness she had never seen from him before, not even in their most honest conversations by the fountain or in the quiet theater corridor. "Alina," he said, "I did not come here today simply to confront your mother. I came because I find that I cannot imagine my future without you in it. I have met a great many people who wish to be near me for what I could offer them. You are the only person who has ever made me feel as though I mattered simply for who I am, without expectation or performance. I do not offer this lightly, and I understand if you require time to consider it. But I wished you to know, clearly and without doubt, that my interest in you was never a mistake, never a passing curiosity, and never for even a single moment meant for your sister instead." The room fell utterly silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. Alina stood frozen, her heart pounding, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes as years of quiet invisibility seemed to dissolve, all at once, beneath the weight of his words. "Your Grace," she managed finally, her voice trembling, "I do not know what to say." "Say nothing if you are not ready," Julian said gently. "I do not wish to pressure you into anything. I only wished you to know the truth of my feelings, spoken openly, in front of your family, so that there could be no doubt remaining about where my attention has always belonged." Margaret sank slowly back into her chair, her face a mixture of shock and something that, despite everything, resembled the faintest flicker of relief. Relief, perhaps, at finally being released from the exhausting burden of managing a future that had never truly been within her control at all. It was Cassandra, arriving in the doorway just moments later, drawn by the unusual commotion, who broke the silence that followed. She took in the scene before her, the Duke standing resolutely beside Alina, their mother pale and shaken in her chair, and something in her expression, after a long moment of visible struggle, softened into quiet acceptance. "It seems," Cassandra said softly, "that I have spent a great deal of energy fighting a battle that was never truly mine to win." Alina turned to her sister, uncertain what to say, but Cassandra crossed the room and, to everyone's surprise, embraced her tightly. "I am sorry," Cassandra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For the tea and for so much more besides. You deserve this happiness, Alina. I see that now, clearly, even if it has taken me far too long to admit it." Alina held her sister close, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, years of quiet hurt and misunderstanding beginning, at last, to heal. News of the Duke of Ashworth's open declaration spread through London society within days, carried from drawing room to drawing room with the particular speed reserved for the most delicious of scandals. But unlike the whispered gossip that usually followed such stories, this one carried an unusual warmth, an admiration that surprised even Alina herself. Word had spread not only of the Duke's affection, but of the quiet courage of the young woman who had endured years of being overlooked, only to be chosen, openly and without hesitation, by one of the most sought-after men in the country. The weeks that followed brought changes Alina could scarcely have imagined only a month before. Julian called upon her regularly, no longer confined to the careful boundaries of chaperoned drawing rooms and crowded ballrooms, but walking openly with her through public gardens, attending church services together, allowing all of London to witness plainly where his attention belonged. He introduced her to his closest friends not as a passing curiosity, but as a woman whose opinions he valued, whose intelligence he admired, and whose company he sought above all others. Margaret, humbled by the confrontation in her own drawing room, began, slowly and imperfectly, to change as well. She never fully abandoned her anxious concern for the family's finances, nor did she entirely stop offering unsolicited advice on propriety and appearance. But she stopped, at least, treating Alina as an obstacle to be managed, and began, in small and halting ways, to see her younger daughter as a person worthy of happiness in her own right. "I did not raise you to be invisible," Margaret admitted one evening, sitting beside Alina in the quiet sitting room, her voice unusually gentle. "I raised you to survive because I was afraid, and fear makes poor decisions seem necessary. I am sorry, Alina. I hope, in time, you will forgive me for the years I spent teaching you to want less than you deserved." Alina reached for her mother's hand, offering a small, genuine smile. "I forgive you, Mother. I understand now what fear can do to a person and how easily it can be mistaken for love. I only hope we can build something better between us going forward." Cassandra's transformation proved perhaps the most surprising of all. Freed at last from the exhausting burden of carrying her family's entire future upon her shoulders, she began to discover interests entirely her own. A genuine talent for painting that had gone unnoticed for years beneath the demands of dance lessons and social performances. A growing friendship with a quiet, thoughtful gentleman named Edward Ashby, who admired her not for her practiced charm, but for the sharp wit and genuine kindness that emerged once she stopped performing for an audience. "I think," Cassandra told Alina one afternoon, watching her sister prepare for another outing with the Duke, "that I spent so many years trying to be dazzling that I forgot to discover who I actually was, underneath all that shine. I am grateful, in a strange way, that everything happened as it did. It forced me to finally look." The sisters grew closer in the months that followed than they had been since childhood, their old rivalry replaced by a genuine, hard-won understanding of one another's struggles. Alina no longer felt the need to shrink herself in her sister's presence, and Cassandra no longer felt the need to guard her position so fiercely. They had both, in their own ways, been taught to see their worth through the eyes of others, and both, slowly, were learning to see it through their own eyes instead. Julian's proposal came on a quiet autumn afternoon, in the same garden where they had first spoken honestly beside the fountain, surrounded by the last of the season's roses. He did not stage an elaborate spectacle, nor did he choose a crowded ballroom where all of London might witness the moment. He chose, instead, the quiet corner where they had first allowed each other to be truly seen. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by grand gestures and empty performances," he said, taking her hands in his own. "I do not wish to offer you another one. I wish only to tell you, plainly and honestly, that I love you, Alina Whitmore, not for what you might offer this family or mine, but simply for who you are, thoughtful, honest, quietly courageous in ways I do not think you have ever fully recognized in yourself. Will you marry me?" Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming fullness of a happiness she had never dared to imagine for herself. "Yes," she said softly, then again, more firmly, "yes, Julian, I will." Their wedding, held the following spring, was a smaller affair than London society expected from a duke, though no less beautiful for its intimacy. Cassandra stood beside her sister throughout the ceremony, her own quiet happiness with Edward Ashby blossoming steadily in the background, no longer a source of competition, but a genuine source of joy shared between sisters who had finally learned to celebrate one another rather than measure themselves against each other. Margaret watched from the front row, her eyes bright with tears that carried both pride and quiet regret for years of fear-driven choices she could not fully undo, but had at last begun to understand. As Alina stood beside Julian at the front of the small chapel, surrounded by soft candlelight and the quiet murmur of gathered friends and family, she thought back to the girl who had once sat quietly at the back of a grand ballroom, told to remain unremarkable, told her sister's brightness was the only light this family could afford to nurture. She thought of every warning, every careful instruction to shrink herself smaller and smaller, until she had very nearly disappeared entirely into the shadows others had built around her. She was not that girl any longer. She stood now in the full light of her own life, chosen not despite her quiet honesty, but because of it, loved not for a performance she had been taught to give, but for the genuine, thoughtful, courageous person she had always been, even in the years no one else had bothered to look closely enough to see it. Julian squeezed her hand gently as the ceremony drew to its close, and when their eyes met, Alina saw reflected there everything she had once believed impossible for a girl told, again and again, to sit quietly and let someone else dazzle. She saw at last a future entirely her own. 5 years passed, and the great house that had once felt cold and empty to a lonely duke now echoed with warmth, laughter, and the small, delighted footsteps of 2 young children who filled its long halls with a joy Julian had never imagined possible during his solitary younger years. Alina had transformed Ashworth House gently over time, filling its formal, untouched rooms with books, with music, with the comfortable clutter of a life genuinely lived rather than merely displayed for the benefit of visitors. She had never lost the quiet thoughtfulness that first drew Julian's attention across a crowded ballroom, but she had grown, steadily and surely, into a woman who no longer feared taking up space in the world. She spoke her mind freely now, in drawing rooms and dinner parties alike, and where once such honesty might have drawn disapproving whispers, it now drew genuine respect from those who had come to know her well. Other young women, quiet and overlooked in the way she once had been, found in the Duchess of Ashworth an unexpected champion, someone who remembered exactly how it felt to sit unnoticed at the edge of a room, and who made a point, wherever she went, of drawing such women gently into conversation, into visibility, into rooms that had never quite made space for them before. Cassandra's marriage to Edward Ashby had proven a quiet, contented match, built on genuine friendship rather than desperate necessity. She had continued painting, her work gaining modest but genuine admiration among London's artistic circles, and she visited Alina often, the 2 sisters spending long afternoons together exactly as they had when they were small children, before fear and pressure had ever come between them. Their children grew up together, cousins as close as siblings, and neither sister ever again allowed the shadow of old rivalry to darken the bond they had worked so hard to rebuild. Margaret, in her later years, softened considerably, her sharp anxieties gradually easing as she watched both her daughters build lives filled with genuine happiness rather than merely secured survival. She often visited Ashworth House, delighting in her grandchildren, and though she never fully abandoned her tendency toward careful, sometimes overbearing advice, Alina had long since learned to receive it with patience rather than old wounds, understanding at last the fear that had driven so many of her mother's difficult choices. Julian, for his part, remained exactly the man Alina had first glimpsed across that crowded ballroom, steady, thoughtful, unmoved by performance or flattery, though the coldness that had once guarded his heart had long since melted away entirely in the warmth of the life they had built together. He often told their children, in quiet moments before bed, the story of how he had first noticed their mother, not because she tried to be noticed, but because she alone, in a room full of careful performances, had simply and honestly been herself. "Your mother taught me," he would say, tucking their daughter into bed on quiet evenings, "that the quietest voice in the room is often the one most worth listening to, if only you take the time to truly listen." Alina, standing in the doorway listening to these familiar words, would smile every time, remembering the girl who had once been told to sit quietly and let her sister dazzle, and marveling at how far that girl had traveled since then. Not by becoming someone louder, someone different, but simply by finally being allowed and finally allowing herself to be exactly who she had always been. In the end, it was never about outshining anyone. It was only about being seen, fully and honestly, by someone willing to look closely enough to notice the quiet, steady light that had been there all along. And Julian Ashworth, from the very first evening their eyes met across a crowded ballroom, had never once looked away.